Snow is coming in sideways. It hits open eyes that have not closed in 3 days. Below a low ridge in northern Montana, close to 700 people are lying flat in trenches they scraped out of frozen ground. With knives, with cookpots, with bare hands. 40 miles away, across a line on a map nobody here can see, is Canada, is safety. Might as well be 4,000 miles. For 3 months, over 1,100 miles, several regiments of the United States Army have been hunting this exact group of families. And they have not won. Not once. Not really. Some of the fighters holding this ridge are 14 years old. Some are grandmothers who buried their own husbands decades ago. For 5 more days, this scattered, freezing, starving group will hold off a force several times their size, using battlefield tactics sharper than anything taught at West Point that year. And the man history put a statue of, the man every textbook credits with all of it, Chief Joseph, may never have commanded a single one of these battles. Read that again. By the end of this video, you will know exactly who outgeneraled the United States Army for 3 straight months, while everyone was watching the wrong man. And you will know why one mistranslated sentence, spoken at the very end, in the snow, rewrote American history for over a century. If you want the battles too brutal for the textbooks, subscribe now, because this story opens with a lie almost everyone still believes. 3 months before that ridge, none of these people had planned to fight at all. The Nez Perce called themselves the Nimi-Poo. For generations, they had been one of the most cooperative native nations on the continent. They guided Lewis and Clark through country that could have killed them. They sold horses to settlers. They signed treaties nobody made them sign twice. Cooperation was the strategy. It did not save them. Chief Joseph, born Hinmatowalaket, inherited leadership of one band from his father. His father had been baptized by missionaries and later tore his own Bible apart in rage after white settlers seized the family's valley. Joseph himself carried no war record. None. He was, by nearly every contemporary account, a skilled negotiator and a devoted family man, remembered specifically for refusing to abandon his own infant daughter in the chaos that was about to start. A statesman, not a general. Keep that in your head for the next hour. The actual military minds of this war were 2 other men, and almost nobody outside a history department knows their names. Looking Glass, a war chief hardened by years of fighting Blackfeet raiders on the open plains, whose own village had been attacked without warning by U.S. troops just weeks before this war began. Whitebird, a shaman strategist in his 70s, trusted in the middle of gunfire to make split-second calls most men half his age could not make. Against them, General Oliver Howard, one arm, lost at Fair Oaks in the Civil War. Deeply religious, deeply certain, zero doubt that he was owed obedience simply because he wore the uniform. Soldiers under him nicknamed him the Christian General, not always as a compliment. Howard was also dragging a documented scandal west with him. Years earlier, as head of the Freedmen's Bureau, he'd been hit with a congressional investigation into missing funds meant for formerly enslaved Americans. He was cleared, technically. The stain never fully washed out. That controversy followed him into Idaho, into every newspaper column written about this campaign, and it meant one thing above all else. He needed a clean, decisive, undeniable win. He needed it badly enough to make decisions a more patient commander never would have made. Howard's soldiers outnumbered the Nez Perce fighters more than 4-1. Rifles, artillery, telegraph that could summon reinforcements in hours. Behind him stood something even heavier, gold, found on Nez Perce land a decade earlier, and territorial politicians in Idaho who wanted these bands gone, treaty or no treaty. On paper, this was never a war. It was an eviction with a military escort. By June 1877, Howard gave the non-treaty bands 30 days to leave the Wallowa Valley, their home, for a reservation in Idaho. Weeks before the deadline, at a council meant to keep the peace, an elder named Toohoolhoolzote argued straight to Howard's face about who actually owned the ground they were standing on. Howard's answer was to jail him for 5 days. He meant to look strong. Instead, he humiliated an old man in front of his own people and hardened every band against compromise before a single shot had been fired. Then, the night before the deadline, a young man named Wallititz, still grieving a father murdered by a settler who walked free, rode out with 2 friends and killed 4 white men along the Salmon River. Not strategy, grief and rage, but it made war unavoidable within hours. The band scattered in panic, regrouped and rode for Whitebird Canyon. On paper, Howard's cavalry should have crushed them there in an afternoon. They did not. By 9 in the morning on June 17th, roughly 100 U.S. soldiers under Captain David Perry rode down into Whitebird Canyon expecting a rout, waiting for them. Maybe 70 Nez Perce fighters, some without uniforms, some without rifles. A truce party rode forward first, waving a white flag. A civilian volunteer riding with the army opened fire anyway. That single shot decided everything. Within 20 minutes, the army line broke. Within an hour, it was a rout in the other direction. 34 soldiers dead in the canyon grass. Nez Perce losses, 0, maybe 2 wounded by some tribal counts. Ollicott, Joseph's younger brother, had positioned ambush lines along the canyon rim before the shooting even started. Using terrain the soldiers never bothered to scout. One of the finest cavalry doctrines of the era, dismantled in under 60 minutes by warriors reading a landscape the U.S. Army didn't think to read. It remains one of the worst single defeats the Army suffered against native forces since the Fetterman fight a decade earlier. Almost nobody outside the region has ever heard its name. Compare that for a second to what you already know about Custer, 1 year earlier, 400 miles north. Same army, same overconfidence, same assumption that a smaller, poorly equipped native force would simply break and run at the first volley. It happened twice in 2 years, in 2 different states, against 2 different nations, and both times the U.S. Army walked in assuming an easy afternoon and walked out, or didn't walk out at all, having badly misjudged exactly who they were fighting. Howard rebuilt his shattered command in days and forced a rematch on the Clearwater River, July 11th and 12th. This time he brought artillery. 2 days of fighting cost him roughly 13 dead and dozens wounded, against maybe 4 to 15 Nez Perce dead. It was the only fight of the entire war Howard could plausibly call a win. Even then, the people he was fighting simply packed up and walked away, intact. Newspapers back east had already run the White Bird story. A one-armed general beaten by, in the ugly language of the day, a band of savages. That headline could end a career. So Howard pushed west with reinforcements. And the bands, now close to 800 people with roughly 2,000 horses, made a decision that still stuns military historians today. They did not scatter into the mountains to hide. They ran east, toward Montana, toward the Buffalo Plains, toward an ally nation they hoped would shelter them, toward Canada itself, where Sitting Bull had already fled after the Little Bighorn the year before. This was not a retreat. This was the evacuation of an entire nation, moving at a walking pace, somehow outrunning the best cavalry the United States had. Stop and think about the logistics of that. Every single day, scouts had to find grass and water for 2,000 horses. Hunters had to feed 800 people without stopping long enough to be caught. Elders and infants slept through mountain nights that dropped well below freezing, while somehow staying ahead of professional soldiers whose only job was to catch them. No war college ran this operation. No supply corps. A rotating council of family leaders decided the next day's route by firelight every single night, while soldiers camped somewhere behind them. Sometimes close, sometimes very close. For 2 months, the bands pushed through Idaho's Bitterroot Mountains, then south along a wagon road straight through the brand-new Yellowstone National Park. Tourists, frozen mid-vacation, watching a war walk past their campsite. Here's the twist nobody expects. The Nez Perce believed they'd negotiated safe passage through Montana's Bitterroot Valley with local settlers, trading peacefully for supplies the whole way. They were wrong. On August 9th, Colonel John Gibbon's men found their camp asleep at dawn on the Big Hole River and opened fire directly into the lodges. Men, women, children died in the first volley, some still wrapped in their blankets. For one frozen moment it looked like this war might end right there, on the frost by the river. It didn't. Warriors regrouped within minutes, using the same discipline that had won Whitebird Canyon, and forced Gibbon's men to abandon their howitzer and dig in for a siege of their own making. 60 to 90 Nez Perce dead, a large share of them women and children, against roughly 31 soldiers. Survivors buried an infant in a hasty grave at dawn, then broke camp within hours, because staying meant certain death for everyone still breathing. One woman later said she dug that grave for her own child with a knife. No shovel had survived the retreat. Sit with that image for a second. It says more than any casualty count ever could. Looking Glass, whose overconfidence in that broken truce had left the camp exposed to slaughter, was pulled from command. Leadership split at the worst possible moment. The flight kept moving, south into Yellowstone, then north again, 25 miles some days, 25 miles. With children, elders, and a horse herd in tow, Howard's men trailed constantly, joined now by Colonel Samuel Sturgis, and eventually Colonel Nelson Miles, whose fresh cavalry hadn't yet burned out in the chase. September 13th, Canyon Creek. Sturgis's cavalry finally catches the rear of the column in open country. Textbook terrain for a cavalry charge. The charge never happens. Nez Perce riders hold a line just long enough for the families and the herd to vanish into broken badlands that swallow the cavalry's advantage whole. 3 soldiers dead, a handful of Nez Perce wounded. By late September, the bands believed they were close enough to Canada to finally slow down. That single miscalculation nearly ended everything. September 30th, Bear Paw Mountains. Miles's forces catch them camped in a shallow basin, resting their horses. 40 miles short of the border. 40 miles. What happens next is not a battle. It is a siege. Miles attacks at dawn and loses men immediately to Nez Perce marksmen already dug into the terrain. Both sides settle in for 5 days of trench warfare on the open northern plains, a tactic almost nobody was using in the Indian Wars at that point. Snow starts falling on day 2. Temperatures drop well below freezing. Ammunition runs low on both sides. Soldiers on the line later say they dug their own rifle pits with knives and mess kits because the entrenching tools got left behind in the rush to catch a fleeing nation. Looking Glass, restored to command after the disaster at Big Hole, is killed on the final day by a single rifle shot. Reportedly, seconds after scouts confirmed that real sanctuary, across the Canadian line, was finally within reach for some of them. One shot. 1 second of bad timing after 5 days of surviving artillery, starvation, and frostbite. That is the kind of detail that never makes it onto a plaque. Think about what 5 days in that basin actually meant. No fires at night, because a fire meant a target. Horses dying of exposure and hunger, tied down in the open, because there was nowhere left to hide 2,000 animals. Wounded men lying in trenches with no surgeons, no morphine, nothing but whatever herbs and cloth the women could still reach. Children going 2-3 days without a hot meal because cooking meant smoke, and smoke meant a sniper's aim point. This was not a shootout. This was a slow-motion siege that broke people down 1 frozen hour at a time. Picture the choice facing every family in that basin on the 4th night. Freeze in an open trench under continuous rifle fire, or try a blind march through enemy lines, in a blizzard, with children strapped to your back. Whitebird refused to surrender. Under cover of the last night, he led 200 to 300 people north on foot, slipping past Miles's lines in the dark, and reached Sitting Bull's camp in Canada within days. Chief Joseph did not go with them. October 5, 1877, his people are starving, freezing, down to maybe 400 survivors from close to 800 at the start. Joseph rides forward on a horse, still carrying old battle wounds, wrapped in a gray blanket against the cold, and hands his rifle to Howard's staff officer, not to Howard himself. Some witnesses read that as a final quiet protest. He surrenders to Howard and Miles. According to Lieutenant Charles Erskine Scott Wood, the interpreter that day, Joseph closed his surrender with 5 words: "I will fight no more forever." Within a generation, it became one of the most quoted lines in American history. Here's what the textbooks leave out. Historians cannot confirm Joseph ever said those exact words. Wood took no verbatim shorthand that day. His written version was assembled afterward, polished, structured with the rhetorical rhythm of a 19th-century oration, not a translated Nez Perce sentence. Wood was a published poet who later reworked his own war journals for literary effect. What Joseph almost certainly said, filtered through interpreters, was some plainer statement of exhaustion and surrender on behalf of the people still with him, true in spirit, almost certainly false in wording. Across the entire war, Whitebird Canyon in June to Bear Paw in October, the Nez Perce fought roughly 18 separate engagements across 4 future states. 18. An operational tempo that exhausted the professional soldiers chasing them. Of the roughly 800 people who left Idaho in June, historians estimate between 150 and 200 died along the way. Combat, cold, starvation, against roughly 180 U.S. soldiers killed across the whole campaign. Olcott, one of the sharpest young fighters of the entire war, died at Bear Paw. Toohoolhoolzote, the elder Howard once jailed for arguing about land, died there too. Families split apart forever in the chaos of Whitebird's escape north. Some never saw each other again. Joseph surrendered, believing Howard and Miles's promise. His people would be home in Idaho by spring. They were not. Roughly 418 survivors were shipped by rail and riverboat to Fort Leavenworth, then to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. The Nez Perce themselves named the place Ikish Pa, the hot place. Malaria killed dozens more within the first year alone. Child mortality was severe enough that some accounts describe entire family lines ending there, in that camp, in that heat. Government inspectors who visited within 2 years found conditions so bad that even army officers who had fought against the Nez Perce months earlier wrote letters back to Washington demanding their return. Men who had recently been trying to kill these same people now arguing to save them. Joseph's own infant daughter, the one he refused to leave behind at the very start of this, survived the surrender only to grow up hundreds of miles from the valley she was born to inherit. For the next 8 years, Joseph petitioned presidents, congressmen, journalists, anyone who would listen, for the return he'd been promised at Bear Paw. He became more famous in captivity than he had ever been in battle. In 1885, roughly half the survivors were finally allowed back to the Pacific Northwest. Joseph was not sent home to the Wallowa Valley. He was resettled on the Colville Reservation in Washington, land that was never his people's own, where he died in 1904. His attending physician wrote the cause of death on paper as simply, a broken heart. So why does one man carry the credit for a war he never tactically led? Because the myth was built by outsiders, not by Joseph. Newspaper correspondents riding with Howard's column needed one face for their dispatches. And Joseph, the civil leader, the man who ultimately surrendered, was the one reporters actually met and photographed. Howard and Miles had every incentive to sell their opponent as a single military genius. Losing to one brilliant mind read a lot better in Washington than losing again and again to a council of elders and war chiefs the army had underestimated collectively. Wood's polished surrender speech sealed it, handing Joseph one unforgettable line that made him, in the public imagination, the sole author of an 1,100-mile campaign he never tactically commanded. The fuller picture, Looking Glass, Whitebird, standing beside Joseph, didn't surface clearly until decades later, once researchers working with Nez Perce oral historians and later scholars digging back through Wood's own private papers exposed how thin the documentary basis for that famous speech actually was. Ask yourself why that took so long. Part of the answer is uncomfortable. The people who could have corrected the record first, the war chiefs, the council elders, the family leaders who actually planned each day's route by firelight, were dead, exiled, or scattered across a reservation system that had no interest in publishing their side. Joseph, meanwhile, was alive, accessible, and willing to keep speaking to reporters for the rest of his life, still hoping it might bring his people home. The myth had a spokesman, the truth did not. By then it was already cast in bronze, printed in schoolbooks, repeated so many times that correcting it took generations, not years. Even today, most museum placards and monument inscriptions still lead with Joseph's name alone. A single face is easier to put on a plaque than a council of 5 or 6 leaders arguing strategy by firelight every single night for 1,100 miles. The convenient story served everyone involved, except the people who actually lived it. 40 miles. That is how close nearly 300 people came to freedom before the snow, the siege, and one overconfident pause at Bear Paw closed the gap forever. Whitebird's group made it across that line. Joseph's did not. The price for stopping short was 8 years of exile in a place that was never home, and a name on a plaque that was never quite the whole truth. You've now stood at the edge of that basin in the snow. You've watched a war fought not by one legendary chief, but by a rotating council of exhausted strategists that history flattened into a single name. And you've seen the quote on the monument for exactly what it is. A poet's polished reconstruction of a broken man's plainer words. What actually happened at Bear Paw was worse, stranger, and far less tidy than the myth carved into bronze across 4 states. If you want the battles too brutal for the textbooks, subscribe, because the next lie history taught you is already waiting.